All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Ben Domenech Podcast, brought to you by Fox News Podcasts. You can check out all of our podcasts at foxnewspodcast.com. I'm happy to be joining you again today with an interesting interview about the future of the American political system. We all know that after 2020, there's a very even divide, a narrow divide that we see at the federal level. Republicans performed exceedingly well when it came to state houses, when it came to state legislatures and the governorships across the country. They performed exceedingly well, beating any experts' recommendations or expectations when it came to the House of Representatives. Yet they underperformed when it came to the presidency, with a much narrower defeat than perhaps the pundits had expected, but still one that left people shaking their heads about how close they had come. Today, I'm going to be talking to someone who is on the other side of the Republican political divide. David Shor is a data scientist who has devoted his life to electing a lot of Democrats and electing particularly progressive Democrats. He's someone who has worked at a number of different jobs, including at Open Labs, a progressive nonprofit. He serves as a senior fellow with the Center of American Progress Action Fund. He worked for many years as a senior data scientist with Civis Analytics in Chicago. He was an advisor to a number of different liberal political action committees. He's a math prodigy who grew up in Miami, Florida, has a math degree from Florida International University. He actually started his undergraduate degree when he was at the ripe old age of 13. He's a multiple award-winning mathematician, someone who is definitely deep into the polling and data side of things. He's also someone who's very interesting to talk to because of his clarifying perspective on the nature of today's political divides. He gave an interview recently to New York Magazine's Intelligencer in which he said this, quote, "So I think the Trump era has been very good for the Republican Party, even if they now momentarily have to accept this very, very, very thin Democratic trifecta. Because if these coalition changes are durable, the GOP has a very rosy long-term prospect for dominating America's federal institutions. The question is, can they get all of the good parts of Trumpism without the bad parts? And I don't know the answer to that question. But when I look at the 2020 election," he says, "I see that we ran against the most unpopular Republican ever to run for president. And we ran literally the most popular figure in our party whose last name is not Obama. And we only narrowly won the Electoral College. If Biden had done 0.3% worse, Donald Trump would have won re-election with just 48% of the two-party vote. We can't control what Trump or Republicans do, but we can add states, we can ban partisan redistricting, we can elevate issues that appeal to both college-educated liberals and a lot of working-class conservatives. If we don't, things could get very bleak very fast." David Shor is one of the few people who I believe really come to these data-centric issues with a level of honesty and respectability, someone who you can appreciate for their perspective, even as you know that they're trying to do something that would elect a particular type of Democrat going forward. It's an interesting conversation, one that engages in a lot of different issues and in the way that the coalitions were really upended by the rise of Donald Trump on both the Republican and the Democratic side. I hope you will listen and learn from this conversation. Coming up, we'll hear from our guest, David Shor. David Shor, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Pleasure to be here.
I want to talk to you about a couple of different things, but first off, I have to start by asking, because I rarely get the opportunity to do this, you're kind of a math whiz, like really a math whiz in the real sense, as opposed to just being someone who knows a few tricks and can impress their friends. When did that start to be a thing that you were obsessed with?
That's a great question. I started college when I was 13 and I was a math major. But sometime in middle school, I started really liking math, and that's kind of how it started. And then I studied it in undergrad. I tried to do about 1 year of graduate level math and then decided I wasn't quite smart enough for it. And that's when I switched to politics.
In the world of politics, I think that there are very few people who legitimately understand math. And so it's kind of an impressive skill to have within the space. What made you want to make that jump into politics? Was it just that you felt more passionate about, using your tools to achieve certain policy ends? What was it that drew you in that direction?
Yeah, now I think if you have quantitative skills, there's a lot of different options. Data science is a big thing now. But back when I was in college, in the mid 2000s, back then the two options were kind of either academia or finance. And I kind of realized early on I didn't really want to do academia. And so I did a little bit of work in finance, and then not to turn anyone here off, but when Barack Obama ran in 2008, I was pretty inspired by that. I was 16, and I started reading 538. Back then he was on Daily Kos, and then he had a little blog spot under the pseudonym Poblano, and that really got me into regression and modeling things. And then I had a blog called Stochastic Democracy that nobody read. And that kind of got me, because I was still taking math classes, but in my free time, I was kind of running this blog, and that's kind of the direction I went in.
In terms of the level of data that we have today about voting patterns and the way that voters behave, is it really night and day difference from where things were even a few years ago?
In some ways, yes. The methods that are being used today in polling, both in the private sector and Democratic and Republican politics, are much, much more sophisticated than they used to be. Now there are national voter files that have things like vote history, so we actually know who's voted in the past and who hasn't. We know things like party registration. We can tie that to polling. There's very sophisticated modeling, I think, that happens on both sides. But I think the interesting thing, and it's something that's very humbling to me, is that I don't think we've gotten better at it. Something I think is really interesting is that technology is supposed to make things easier or problems easier. But in public opinion research, as technology has gotten better, response rates have declined. With telephone surveys, if you go back to the 1940s, something like 80% of people would answer phone surveys. And the reason is that the world used to be a lot more boring. You'd have someone sitting around at home. There was no television. There was, maybe you had some radio, and they'd get a phone call, and then they'd say, "Oh my God, a public opinion researcher wants to know my opinions on contemporary events." And then they would, they'd stop what they were doing and answer. And now telephone surveys have closer to a 1% response rate. And, the problem is that this 1% is very non-random, in a lot of different ways. People who answer surveys, have a lot more trust in institutions. And, we think this is one of the big reasons why polling was wrong in 2016. They're much more politically engaged. Something like 90% of people who answer phone surveys vote. And there's a bunch of other ways. Obviously they're whiter, they're richer, they're older. There's a whole host of things. And so as that's happened, the industry has really had to become much more sophisticated, because in order to kind of correct for how weird survey takers are. And that's been the big challenge. I think I've been, doing polling and election forecasting since 2012. And I feel like the sophistication of the kind of work we do has increased tremendously. I think in terms of pure computational flops, we use maybe 100 orders of magnitude, 100 or 1,000 times more computing power than we did in 2012. But our results haven't gotten more accurate. And so it's really this treadmill, because, now there's this market for attention and time, and it's much harder to get people to answer surveys.
Mm-hmm. There's, of course, a lot of skepticism out there about polling generally, particularly given the way that people interpret them versus the outcomes that they see. What's right about that impulse among American citizens, and what's wrong in terms of their analysis and takeaways when they feel like polls are missing so often?
Yeah, I think an important thing to remember about polling, 2020 was an unusually bad year for polling, and 2016 was, I think, a relatively bad year for polling. I think the important thing to remember, though, is that polling has never been super accurate. I don't really remember 1996, but, obviously, Dole ended up considerably outperforming his polling there. And so these kind of misses happen all the time. The thing that's really changed that I think is underappreciated in the discussion is that elections are a lot closer than they used to be. If you look over the history of American democracy and you look at the list of the top 10 closest elections, something like 6 or 7 of them have been in the.
For the full podcast, go to foxnewspodcast.com.